It is the 90s, and there is time for
Laird's Lair.
Good morning, good afternoon, and good evening viewers. I'll be the first to admit that I had no intention of reviewing Kieren Hawken's book The A-Z of Commodore 64 Games, but an interesting post by graphics artist Steve Day on Atari Age piqued my interest. It all started when Kieren wrote a review of Sanction that was intended to be used in a book about legendary games publisher Thalamus. The review was passed on to Steve, who was absolutely shocked by the diabolical quality of it. Steve sent back a message along the lines of,
"You have to be kidding me. It's a copy and paste job that's full of factual inaccuracies, has no soul at all, and I seriously doubt the writer has ever played this game in their life."
Kieren's work was also passed on to A-Z of C64 magazine editor Roger Keane, who basically said that he agreed with Steve's comments. This is what got me interested. The idea that this man, who claims to be an authority on gaming and a well-regarded writer, could be attempting to fabricate a career for himself seemed absurd. However, the more I looked into the situation, the more ludicrous things became. Could it be that the self-proclaimed Mr. Atari was nothing more than a snake oil salesman? I simply had to find out. So, let's take a look at this book, which is yet another pointless homage to cut and paste. Like my previous review, I'll be going through a small selection of pages from the book and giving you my thoughts. First up, the cover is a big improvement over those seen on Kieren's awful Atari ST books, with their putrid green backgrounds and heavily pixelated fonts. So, at least they've improved in that regard. Sadly, it's all downhill once we get inside and the retro gaming scene's Walter Mitty takes the reins. Don't judge a book by its cover, they say, and in this case they're correct. The cover at least implies a level of semi-professionalism. Unfortunately, where the drivel contained inside is concerned, that implication is grossly off target. If only our good friend Mr. Atari had spent more time focusing on his writing than wearing so many different hats. He's a cordon bleu chef, ready to reheat chips in the microwave at the drop of a hat.
Do you want any extra sachets of ketchup?
He's a famous video game celebrity and journalist, clinging like a man in freefall to his 15 seconds, rather than 15 minutes, of fame. He's the Katie Hopkins of the Atari scene, and a man who succeeded in getting a crowdfunding campaign to fund his own book to the tune of 8% before it was pulled from fundraising after 10 months and never released. He's an up-and-coming comedian, with a unique ability to blend his passions of retro gaming, event organizing and writing together in such a seamless manner that many refer to him as the Billy Connolly of the retro scene. He's a modern-day Rain Man, blessed with a photographic memory, able to recall every last detail about games he played more than 30 years ago. He's a lightning-fast typist, able to cut and paste from Wikipedia in the blink of an eye. And last, but very much not least, this man was a child prodigy, authoring a string of games across different formats before he could even say the word, Atari Age. He even found time to set up his own publishing arm, Laird Games, with the intention to release a series of more niche titles. Yes, it seems that Kieren is every bit the retro gaming renaissance man, whether he's engaged in an ill-advised and heated shouting match at a retro gaming event, or relaxing on the island of Tenerife, his home from home, where he can really let his hair down and be himself. It's easy to understand how any one of these things could take a lot of his time, let alone doing them all. Really, we should feel honored that he spent a period of his life churning out 17 books a day. Thankfully, as a direct result of this, we now have the benefit of his peerless insights in portable format. While the COVID pandemic has caused carnage for many around the world, it's safe to say that Kieren has flourished in 2020, and it's been an extremely successful year for him. He found time amongst his hectic schedule to release 2 new retro gaming print books. His book sales went through the stratosphere, with print runs selling out faster than a Mormon on his wedding night. He added yet another string to his almost endless bow with the publication of not 1, but 2 novels under his pen name. He's known simply as The Machine, and he clearly doesn't need to sleep, as he was also the lead writer for the hugely popular Atari 2600-7800 visual compendium book. Mr. Atari is literally the definition for the word success. We're just about ready to get going, but one more thing.
I cheated a little.
It's important to note that Kieren stole all of the screenshots that he used in this book from various YouTube videos. Each review covered here will state where these screenshots were taken from. These clips are used under fair use, and I have nothing but respect for the creators, who've had their work published and monetized without their permission. So, my friends, it's time to get our brains into gear for a rollicking ride through ridiculous rip-off retro reviews as we appraise the A-Z of C64 Games, by award-winning author Kieren Hawken. I had a real sense of déjà vu reading this review, and decided to compare it to the ZX Spectrum review in one of Kieren's other books. And, I must say, I use the term book in the loosest sense of the word. The review on the left is from Kieren's A to Z of ZX Spectrum Games Volume 1, and the review on the right is from his Commodore 64 book. Both contain a single screenshot of the game, both contain a single huge lump of text, and both titles were awarded identical scores of 9 out of 10. If we highlight the differences between the two, you can see that a grand total of 12 words were removed from the ZX Spectrum review and substituted in the Commodore version. There is nothing written here that suggests Kieren has ever played the C64 version himself. What he seems to call his work involves cobbling together a review using spit and plasters, as best he can, after reading a wiki or watching a video. Then he'll cut and paste it into multiple books, for multiple different systems. Sometimes he'll change the name of the system mentioned in the review, other times he'll not even bother. He's well known for writing reviews for games he's never actually played, and has been exposed for it on numerous occasions. For example, he was famously caught out in issue 125 of Retro Gamer magazine when he reviewed the game Apocalypse on the Acorn Archimedes. In his review, Kieren stated,
"We should probably mention the sound too, as Apocalypse features some rocking music to accompany the arcade quality effects."
It turns out that the game had no music, and the video's uploader had overlaid a music track to make the video more interesting. The self-proclaimed Mr. Atari purports to have a photographic memory, in addition to encyclopedic knowledge of games on almost every platform, yet in reality he's very much the jack of all trades, master of none. A search for Arkanoid C64 longplay will lead you to a video by Der Schmoo, and if you skip ahead to the 5-minute 55-second mark, you'll see the screenshot Kieren used in his book perfectly matches the video. Overlaying the video onto Kieren's book and letting it play unlocks a hidden Easter egg in Kieren's book. This hidden feature could be described as, match the stolen screenshot to the original video.
Arkanoid is not about graphics or sound.
Okay, so a black screen and silence is Arkanoid. This is just another stupid thing, like the 100 other stupid things I have personally heard him say when he's had a drink over a curry. He also completely neglects to mention the Martin Galway soundtrack, which any sensible reviewer would most certainly have touched upon. Arkanoid was the first C64 title with music which contained sampled sounds. This is something Kieren clearly knew nothing about, and sadly, this is very much the mantra going forward in this book. He gives the game a 9 out of 10, citing it as one of his favorites on the system. It's a shame then, that he was completely unable to write anything interesting about it whatsoever. Unfortunately, for us readers, this review is only the beginning. A review that really highlights how completely pointless these books are, would have to be Bomb Jack. Kieren claims the game was published by Elite in 1985, when the C64 game was not released until mid-1986. It even displays this on the title screen if he'd bothered to check. The screenshot Kieren chose happens to be from an unusual version of the game, quite possibly hacked by a software piracy group, as the original cassette release increments the score in blocks of 10 and begins with a high score of 100,000 points. The king of search and replace forgot to substitute the word specky with C64 when he fabricated this review. When discussing the enemy's behavior, we are told that
they are not very stupid either, unlike many games of this type.
It's up to the reader to guess whether the enemies in question are actually rather intelligent, or merely stupid rather than very stupid. I strongly suspect that Kieren has never played the C64 version, as there's no mention of the overly large player sprites that hinder gameplay, nor the modified level layouts that prevent jumping over enemies. But for me, the greatest problem is the final review score of 9 out of 10. Either Kieren thinks this is a fantastic C64 arcade conversion, or he made a blunder when duplicating the review from the ZX Spectrum book. Zap 64 magazine savaged the game, awarding it a mere 47%, and the average score from Lemon 64 users is in the high 6s out of 10. If the Elite conversion of the game happened to be as amazing as Kieren is proclaiming here, the efforts of a group of homebrewers that are currently creating Bomb Jack Deluxe on the C64 would be completely unnecessary.
What is there left to say about this iconic game?
The answer to that would be, not much, and the chances of the Laird being the one to break new ground on this front, are slim to none. If Kieren is so sure his audience has played Bobble before, why does he bother to waste a paragraph waffling on about how it's a two-player single-screen bubble-blowing platformer? And despite Kieren claiming it to be a two-player game, it can be played in single-player mode.
Playing the parts of Bub and Bob, two humans who have been magically turned into dinosaurs.
Another sentence, another mistake. Bub and Bob are dragons, not dinosaurs. We are then unreliably informed that
you might fight your way through each level in order to return to your original form.
Fighting through each level is clearly an optional gameplay mechanic. Perhaps standing completely still for the entire game and hoping the enemies don't notice you is a recommended Kieren method to completing the game. To make matters worse, Kieren can't even manage to comprehend, or correctly report, one of the most basic and obvious gameplay aspects.
Look out for the bonus bubbles that contain letters spelling the word extra.
Extend. The word is extend. Is there a letter, D, in the word extra? I don't believe there is. If he'd even looked at the screenshot, the one sitting above this rubbish dump of a review, the one that has a letter D floating in a bubble on the playfield, he might have realized his mistake. Of course, it's stolen from a YouTube video, as usual, so it's not as if he had to pay attention to, or play the game, to throw this together. But it's there, it's 100% obvious, and there's still not a D in extra.
If you get all the letters you activate a warp, taking you several levels ahead.
This is completely untrue. Collecting all letters from the word extend results in an extra life being awarded, and you will skip ahead to the next level, not several levels as Kieren claims. He continues to ramble, then switches into caveman mode.
Visually the game excellent.
The retro gaming Rain Man uses his unique Zen-like abilities to power his brain down into a coma-like state of paralysis, where he is able to use his eyes to enjoy the soundtrack.
Tim Follin's rendition of the original soundtrack is just a joy to behold.
There's not much to say after this. He gives the game a 10 out of 10, the true mark of an ignorant armchair critic who understands nothing about reviewing. Then again, when you've churned out this review by copying the text from your ZX Spectrum book and simply substituted the name of the computer to create the C64 version, there's not a lot left to say. Kieren gets himself into all kinds of confusion here. To start, we learn that the game was
converted from the TAD Corporation coin-op of the same name.
Which is very interesting. It obviously managed to buck the trend of arcade games always being given totally different names for their home computer ports. That was sarcasm.
As well as a gun, you are also armed with a limited number of hand grenades and a rather stupid dance which you use to run into the distance at the end of each level.
It's once again clear that Kieren has not played this game. It is also clear that he does not understand the basics of armed combat. A rather stupid dance is not a weapon. You do not arm yourself with a stupid dance. This is ridiculous. It's made even more so by the fact that this rather stupid dance does not even exist in the C64 version, with the player character simply walking off the side of the screen at the end of each level. We're not quite done with the stupidity here yet. Kieren goes on to unleash this garbage.
Compared to the arcade game, and in fact the home computer conversions by Ocean, this is a very good conversion indeed.
The letters WTF come to mind. So, compared to the arcade game, which isn't a conversion but is implied to be by this grammatical nightmare, the C64 version is a good conversion. It's also one of the home computer versions, being as the C64 is a home computer, so it also compares very favorably with itself. This is gutter-level writing of the lowest kind. And, if we're talking of conversions, this review was not a very good one, being as it's copy-pasted almost word for word from his ZX Spectrum review.
Stop bragging, Spectrum fans.
Are they bragging about the fact that you actually chose to write this rubbish for them, before making a poor quality port for another system? Is that why they are bragging? Kieren, are they bragging because the C64 fans have wasted their money on your cut-and-paste trash? Eagle-eyed viewers may notice the damage meter, lives, grenades and score missing from the screenshot Kieren included in his book. There were actually 2 Commodore 64 versions of Cabal released, not that you'd find out about this in his review, but Kieren simply pressed the print screen button to create his screenshot. He merely watched the long play of the European edition by recorded C64 Games at 21 minutes and 22 seconds. The dead giveaway to his pilferage was the fact the original YouTube video only recorded the main gameplay area and not the full display. If Kieren had actually gone to the trouble of playing the game himself, he would have noticed the missing information and been able to create an accurate screenshot instead. Kieren's review of Double Dragon says that
this god-awful Commodore 64 port gets so much wrong I don't even know where to start.
I feel exactly the same way about his review, and more broadly speaking, all his A to Z game review publications. Let's get the obvious out of the way early. Kieren hasn't played the game himself, and simply stole the screenshot from Al82's longplay at the 9-minute 42-second mark. This review is also, pretty much, a copy of his ZX Spectrum review from another book. Bear this in mind as we dissect this garbage, and dissect is the correct word. This paltry attempt at pitiful prose has as much life as a corpse. In his first of many blunders, he states that the game features the machine gun-toting Willy. To be fair, the character does exist, but Kieren criminally fails to mention that he's unable to shoot in the Commodore 64 version. Kieren then claims that the massive Abobo chucks you around like a toy, but just a little further down in the review he states that the game features flickery sprites that look exactly the same for every character. So are they all the same, or is Abobo massive compared to the others? The truth is that Abobo is completely missing from the C64 version of the game, and no character smashes through the wall like we see in the original arcade coin-op. We're then told that there are many moves at your disposal, yet Kieren lists only 3 moves including flying kicks. If Kieren had actually played the C64 version, he'd know that the flying kick is actually nothing more than a jump, because you can never kick the enemies while jumping. The review then states that you can pick up weapons including knives and rocks. Neither of these exist in the C64 version. The Bard of Bullshit then has a pop at the music, stating,
"The title tune isn't very good either."
The music is the one saving grace from this dire conversion, and Lemon 64 users are almost universal in their praise of the soundtrack, which was written by the maniacs of noise. It's such a shame this is being played on a system that he has publicly stated, in his educated opinion, is awful. If he was in any way an objective or professional reviewer, then this sort of childish petulance would be left at the door. By this point in time Kieren could have dug a big enough grave for both his non-existent career and overinflated ego with the amount of pointless digs he's had at other systems. The game earns 3 out of 10, which by pure serendipity happens to be the exact same score it received in his ZX Spectrum book. If you compare the text, you can understand why. There are minimal changes between the pair. Kieren is full steam ahead from the start here with a couple of incredible pieces of classic Hawken. We're told that,
released in 1985, The Empire Strikes Back is not just the third film in the original Star Wars trilogy, it is also the third game in the arcade game trilogy.
It doesn't take a genius to appreciate that what he's saying here is very inaccurate. I am not even sure how someone could make such obvious and ignorant mistakes in the first place, let alone okay them in proofing. It's very embarrassing for Kieren. How can he hope to keep people on the hook to read the rest of an article when he starts it by highlighting his complete lack of knowledge on the subject? What does anyone have to gain from reading on after such stupidity? In Kieren's mind, The Empire Strikes Back is the last film of the Star Wars trilogy. Could this fact alone offer us a window into his world, a world where dissatisfaction reigns supreme? For Kieren, the meandering and ultimately depressing second act follows the climax, and it doesn't take an Oscar-winning scriptwriter to see that this is an allegory for his own pathetic life. This particular review is such a Frankenstein-esque disaster that it literally collapses under the weight of its own cut and paste. Wikipedia references, cuts from his other reviews and all kinds of other garbage come together to create a farrago of twattery. We could be here forever, picking over this and exposing layer upon layer of inbuilt failure.
It was originally released as an upgrade kit for Star Wars, then as a standalone game, so as you can probably guess it has far more in common with the original game than the second.
So the game has more in common with its predecessor than it does with itself? Let's think about that. Empire Strikes Back has far more in common with Star Wars than The Empire Strikes Back. This takes things to a whole new level of confusion. It came out first as an upgrade kit, so that's the first one, but then it also came out as a standalone, which is the second one, unless there's one missing someplace that we're not being told about. I suggest we work with what we have. So, the game itself has more in common with the upgrade kit, which it is, than it does with the second release, which it also is. I'm not lying when I say that it's been very hard to navigate this review, mentally, even to this point. I'd say it's dangerous to anyone not of extremely low intellect. Only an imbecile could read this and not take offense at these pointless and moronic ramblings.
In the second half of the game you take the role of Han Solo piloting at the head of a convoy trying to escape the Imperial onslaught.
I think Kieren's bed is probably against a wall on all sides but one, and, unfortunately, the one side he can get out of is the lying side. So, when he gets up in the morning, he's going to get right back to his stock in trade. In the game, there is a section where you are shooting at TIE fighters and a section where you are flying through an asteroid field. Both of these points are presumably based on the same scenes from the film. In both of these scenes, the Millennium Falcon is very much like Kieren these days, flying solo. Then, finally, we're treated to the ultimate bombshell in the review. We're suddenly given a few scant sentences at the very end about the C64 version. Nothing more than that. Everything prior to this is about the arcade game. Think you've been reading a review of a C64 game in a book devoted to reviews of C64 games? Think again. You've just read an imaginary arcade flyer written by a confused, ignorant fool, with a particularly anorexic chunk of lip service paid to what he's supposed to have been doing. If you want the true story about this game, or the film itself, you can read about them both over on Wikipedia. For free. Ultimately, and after waffling inaccuracies about the arcade original for almost the full review, he states that the C64 version is quite slow, but close to the arcade version. That's the sum total of the review. That's your lot. One line, coupled with his subjective opinion that you should own it. If we remove the fabricated life story of the arcade game, this review is basically a haiku. The Laird gives the game an 8 out of 10. Kieren's leaving skid marks again, and they're not all over the racetrack, they're all over the page in this particularly execrable excuse for a review. According to Kieren, Enduro Racer
took the already popular hang-on games and added a host of new elements to the gameplay, giving it a real nice point of difference from other races of the time.
Well, I hope we're all clear on that. The game adds a host of different extras to those present in another game, in order to gain only a singular differentiating factor between itself and
other races of the time.
I'm not sure what we're supposed to take from this, and I'd also disagree with his implication that this is in some way a successor to the hang-on titles. Although it was created on, more or less, the same base hardware, the game was never intended to be a sequel, nor was it ever claimed to be. By Kieren's rules here, every game on the Neo Geo is a sequel to every other game on the Neo Geo. Every Atari 800 game is a sequel to every other Atari 800 game. It's a ridiculous suggestion and one that, as usual, stands up to no scrutiny whatsoever. Then we're informed that Enduro Racer isn't even a racing game, which is odd, as the word racer seems to be in the title. Still, according to Kieren,
Enduro Racer focuses more on pulling off tricks and stunts than the actual racing.
But then he changes his mind shortly afterwards, completely making a mockery of his previous outlook on the game, which was expertly espoused only 2 sentences before.
Like Hang On, the objective of the game is to race to the next location within a strict time limit.
This is just becoming asinine at this point. Does Kieren ever go back to read the rot that he's written? In one sentence he says the game is about stunts, with the focus being on them rather than the racing. Then only a few words later the game is a racer wherein you're pitted against the clock to finish the stage as quickly as possible. Surely even someone as stupid as Kieren can comprehend that this is not the way to get your point across. Unfortunately, the confusion continues as Kieren goes on to say,
watching out for obstacles and jumping over them becomes the key feature.
So again, which is it? It was a stunts game, where you do stunts and tricks. Then it was a racing game, where you're trying to ride as fast as you can, to make it to the next stage in time. Now it's some kind of obstacle course. The game gives you points for moving forwards. That's it. Forward movement gains points. You do not get more for jumps or these supposed tricks that Kieren refers to. This, coupled with the on-screen time limit, would suggest it's not in any way a stunt or trick-based game and that you are very much intended to make it to the finish as quickly as possible. Kieren also states that the frame rate is very bad, and then complains that the game is very slow. It's strange that he feels the need to say the same thing twice. It's almost as if he doesn't equate the two. So strange from a man whose self-proclaimed encyclopedic knowledge of the games he writes about has caused such jealousy from others that he's been completely thrown out of the community he built and named, single-handedly. Kieren really doesn't have much good to say about this game. In fact, he doesn't say anything good about the game. Everything in the review is negative.
An extremely painful experience I wouldn't recommend taking part in.
It's very strange, then, that he goes on to give the game 8 out of 10. Maybe he means 8 out of 10 on the scale of bad things where 10 is the worst, but unfortunately he's forgotten to mention that he's working with a different scoring system for this review. Or it could just be the fact that he copied the shell of the text from his ZX Spectrum review, which he, coincidentally, gave an 8 out of 10. And if you're wondering which version of Enduro Racer Kieren supposedly reviewed, it seems to be the original release, not the version that appeared on a Bo Jolly compilation, which was a completely different game and which clearly Kieren is oblivious to. It's not like this filibustering fool wouldn't have announced the existence of this version, had he been aware of it, as one of his supposedly unknown facts. The screenshot used in Kieren's review happens to be from a Dershmu longplay at the 1-minute 28-second mark. You'd think Mr. Atari would take extra care with his reviews of Atari titles, but if anything, they're every bit as much of a mess as, if not worse than, the rest of his nonsense. I suspect the sight of an Atari logo on anything sends Kieren into an almost orgasmic state, blood flowing directly away from his brain, rendering him incapable of writing coherent sentences or performing even the most basic of fact checks. It's got to be that. Or maybe he sacked his proofreader shortly before writing all his Atari game reviews. I'm beginning to wonder if Kieren invented his own alternative calendar, what with the high number of incorrect release dates listed in his publications. He's botched the release year here, once again, claiming that Hard Drivin was released in 1989, rather than the correct date of September 1990. He follows this mistake by waxing lyrical about the arcade original, and how it supposedly wowed audiences, setting the standard for all future driving games. And as is so common with his reviews, we're told,
"This specky version is surprisingly accurate."
When you've paid good money for a book of Commodore 64 reviews, it's a real kick in the teeth to find you're reading a recycled review from a ZX Spectrum book. Still, it's good to know how low Kieren sets his standards for a machine he despises, as he considers the 3 frames per second the C64 game exhibits to be adequate for a fairly decent sense of speed. Apparently.
The controls may take some getting used to for many, but once you master them you will get a lot of fun out of the game.
Things are looking up. According to Kieren, the C64 game is fast, and provides a lot of fun if you just persevere with it. An idiot might say the same about hitting himself in the head with a rock.
And finally get to that final race against the legendary Photon Phantom.
Legendary. More like disappointing. Domark have substituted the final driver with some wannabe. In the arcade version, you race the Phantom Photon, not the Photon Phantom. And this isn't the only strange thing taking place on the track, as Kieren's review now promptly veers off into a hedge.
It looks like it's based on the Spectrum version with its monochrome graphics but is even slower with far worse frame rate. I think we all know that this conversion was never going to turn out well, but I don't think anyone thought it would be this bad.
Well, this is quickly becoming another Empire Strikes Back, or Enduro Racer, review fiasco. Kieren reported earlier that the game had a fairly decent sense of speed and much fun was to be had. Now he's changed his mind mid-review, telling us that it's a slow monochrome game with a terrible frame rate, and that nobody thought the game could possibly be so awful. Kieren ends the review as confused as the rest of us after being subjected to this nonsense, and scores the game 3 out of 10. Presumably he never managed to master the controls, as apparently the game is a lot of fun after that. If you want a real rundown of Hard Drivin, it's probably best to watch Mame Meister's video with his own commentary on YouTube, particularly at the 3-minute 22-second mark, where Kieren extracted his screenshot from. Or you could read the original Zap 64 review, where the team informed their readers that the game was so poor that Domark decided to only release it as part of a couple of big box compilations. Kieren's review of Indiana Jones and the Temple of Doom bears a striking similarity to the Wikipedia entry for the game. The introduction paragraph contains the same information in the exact same order as Kieren's game review. The only difference is a few words switched around willy-nilly. On the top we can see the Wikipedia original, with Kieren's cribbing clearly visible underneath. This is elementary school stuff, it really is. You cannot simply lift someone else's work and change a word here or there, especially if the original work's free and you have the audacity to charge for your plagiarism. After the cut-and-paste tomfoolery ceases, we're once again plunged into the journalistic toilet, as Kieren firmly takes hold of the reins with the classic sentence.
This 1987 Commodore 64 conversion of the game is missing all those amazing features though, sadly.
This is not only a grammatical nightmare on many levels, but the point he's trying to make is also incorrect. He states that the arcade features digitized speech, and John Williams' classic score, but then goes on to make the statement insinuating that all those features are missing. However, this isn't the case. For anyone who's played the game, or even watched a YouTube video of it with the sound on, which perhaps Kieren neglected to do, you'll no doubt be aware that the John Williams theme plays throughout. As this supposed review goes on, we're once again treated to Mr. Atari's trademark style of non-journalism.
The graphics here are reasonable but the enemies look a bit blurry and indistinct.
And
the sound is reasonable enough but the music gets very annoying indeed after a while.
Both stand as good examples of his non-committal, cavalier attitude to anything that might approach being insightful. Reasonable is a word that is used a lot in his reviews, presumably to act as a get-out-of-jail-free card in future if anyone pulls him up about the fact that he's clearly not played a lot of the games he's claiming to be extremely familiar with. Something that is reasonable is, in essence, acceptable. It needn't be anything more. Or less. A reviewer saying something is reasonable is as helpful as a supposed expert fisherman telling you that you might catch a fish anywhere that there is water. He finishes this particular review by bemoaning the lack of a truly good Indiana Jones game. Presumably he forgot Raiders of the Lost Ark on the Atari 2600, as if he had remembered it then it would surely have been held up as the best possible example of everything, ever. 6 out of 10 is the score in this review, which is odd considering it is a complete and playable game and he gave his own garbage video CD 10 out of 10. I think you'd get much more entertainment from this game than watching 30 minutes of compressed footage thrown together by a buffoon. The screenshot was pinched from a video by Nils Haxar at 1 minute 13 seconds. Joe Blade is a game about defusing bombs within a time limit. As is not uncommon with Kieren, he completely misunderstands this key point. His suggestion, that he believes would improve it, would be to remove
the bloody bombs,
because he finds them difficult and annoying. So, the game would be brilliant if it was pointless. Once again, another perfect example of the mole rat's incredible journalism. Another thing he must get a round of applause for researching is his implication that Joe Blade 3 exists on the C64. While the game was teased for the system, it was never released. Kieren gives Joe Blade a 7 out of 10, but notes that he would have scored it much higher if the objective had been absent from the game. Slightly higher would have presumably been a score of 8, therefore, much higher, would be 9 or even 10 out of 10. Given that Kieren rated the original Turrican on the C64 worthy of only 8 out of 10, Joe Blade would have been a better game to play than Turrican if they'd only had the foresight to stop development a few months earlier. As usual, Kieren didn't need to play the C64 version. Instead he took a screenshot while watching Al-82's longplay at the 1 minute 48 second mark. It is the 90s, and there is time for yet another cookie-cutter review from Mr. Atari. If you've suffered through more than one of these publications, you'll recognize the typical review template Kieren uses, particularly for Atari titles on gaming platforms he is unfamiliar with. The review will be along the lines of,
"This classic Atari arcade game wowed the audiences when it was released in, insert year here. Such was the popularity of this Atari game that struggling arcade owners on the precipice of financial oblivion turned their businesses around almost overnight, and many were forced to hire extra floor space to allow for the large queues of eager punters waiting to play the game. Those with the foresight to purchase multiple Atari arcade machines became instant millionaires, and most of them have gone on to become billionaires or even trillionaires. This unique game was very much based on an earlier Atari game, but isn't given the credit it deserves. After a ferocious bidding war by publishers desperate to convert this Atari hit, it was converted to just about every home computer format under the sun, including the good old, insert name of unfamiliar computer here. Not many people know that this game starts off easy, but as it progresses, it becomes harder. I have such fond memories of this Atari game, and remember my best friends Beast 666 and Forza 77 coming over to my house and us all playing this well into the wee small hours. The graphics here are reasonable, if a little washed out and muddy, and the sound is adequate. Shame they left out all the speech, but it's the gameplay here that really shines. This, insert name of computer version isn't the best one. That title belongs to the Lynx, but this underrated game from Atari is incredibly addictive and should be an instant purchase for any, insert name of computer owner. 9 or 10 out of 10.
Klax follows this template to a T. The only thing left to add is the screenshot, which Kieren lifted from Darkleon's recording after clipping off the watermark at 3 minutes and 26 seconds. In a book full of dreadful reviews, LED Storm stands out as one of the absolute worst. The review starts off badly, claiming that the game was released in 1988. In actual fact, the 8-bit versions were released in 1989. Kieren follows this up with a screenshot pinched from Al-82's longplay at the 2 minute 43 second mark. The opening sentence spells the word laser incorrectly, with the Z replaced with the letter S. Kieren then claims that the game plays like an update of the classic Bally Midway game Spy Hunter. I would dispute this point, as the driving and jumping mechanic resembles the game Bump and Jump far more than Spy Hunter. Then there's the typical spelling mistake in a clumsy sentence where Kieren writes,
"Your car is blessed with the ability to jump though, which does come in very useful."
After the main waffle, we are unreliably informed that the best thing about the game is the sound, apparently composed by Tom Fallon. The composer's first name is Tim, not Tom, and the title music is indeed excellent. However, for those of us that witnessed the dumpster fire that was the Q&A panel at Play Blackpool, you may remember that Kieren had a very different viewpoint when he posed a question to Tim Fallon.
Let's do it, incredible.
I remember the Uridium one, so I remember, and I think they did you do Commodore 64?
Yeah, the Commodore 64 tree is totally different though.
Is it?
Yeah, it's totally
right,
different
okay.
It's really strange.
Right.
Yeah.
Oh, I think I remember this, yeah.
Yeah, the Amigas and Atari Spectrum tunes are the same, and the Commodore 64 tree is something totally different that doesn't fit the game at all. It just sounds really weird.
Right. So that's what
it might have been yours, I'm not sure, but...
it probably is, it's weird, doesn't it?
Yet Kieren's C64 review states that the music is excellent, and definitely not really weird rubbish that didn't suit the game at all. A large section of us were head in hands that day when Kieren piped up, and I believe that he's now been banned from that particular event, along with many others. Kieren follows this up with yet another cock-up, writing the word underrated as 2 words instead of 1. To finish off this complete train wreck of a review, the majority of the text is a copy and paste job from Kieren's other books, complete with an identical score. Kieren loves to add sweeping statements to make himself out to be some kind of authority, and Lemmings from Psygnosis is no exception. Kieren's review states,
"The idea of Lemmings is to guide your troop of blue-haired death merchants through each level trying to save as many as possible. You have probably played Lemmings to death over the years, most people have.
I would argue that with a current worldwide population of approximately 7.8 billion people, most people have not played Lemmings to death. In fact, I would say it is certainly the case that the majority of those 7.8 billion people have not played Lemmings at all, let alone, to death, as Kieren puts it, once again recycling words with his second use of death in as many sentences. Reading on, I'm unsure whether Kieren has even played the game himself. It's possible he wrote the review from memory, or perhaps he's simply color blind, but the in-game Lemmings have green hair, not blue as he claims. To add insult to injury, their overalls are blue. So, to put it simply, anyone who has paid any attention to what's happening on screen in the game would recall this, and remember, that's a lot of people, according to the Mole Rat. Kieren's review states that the gameplay area is confined to a small window, but he doesn't, and most likely cannot, explain why. It's almost certain that Kieren didn't understand the technical limitations involved when porting the game from the original 16-bit version, as he has no real interest in the C64 as a computer. In fact, he makes no secret about his hatred for the system, even referring to it as the Commode 64 at times. He presents himself as an authority, to such a level that he believes people should pay for his insights, yet he's writing about a system he's demonstrably seldom played and that he holds an open and public disdain for. It's just own goal after own goal. The screenshot was swiped from Gansteith's video at the 6-minute and 52-second mark. The first sentence of the Milk Race review, and once again a mistake that was missed by Kieren's sacked proofreader.
Milk Race is without doubt one of my most loved titles from Mastertronic's vast budget range.
If you watched the original Atari ST book review I did, you may recall that Kieren seemed to really struggle with the word 2, and he's never quite sure whether to write the word with 1 or 2 O's. He's made the same mistake in the Milk Race review, including an extra O in this sentence. Speaking of which, I'm struggling to think of a good reason why the author talked about his lactose intolerance in the first place. This information is completely irrelevant to everyone, and has no place in a book about Commodore 64 games. The author took great pains to point out that milk was shoehorned into the game in the form of milk bottles to collect, as if it was some great mystery he unlocked with the Rosetta Stone. The screenshot was taken from Il-C Bass's longplay at the 35-second mark. Kieren made sure to crop out the watermark that was on the original YouTube video in the bottom right-hand corner. It's obvious that Kieren regurgitated the Ms. Pacman review from his ZX Spectrum book, as Kieren forgot to replace the words, "this specky version," from the text, and he also mentioned the game having minimal color clash, something you don't see on the C64.
This specky version of the arcade classic is really well done and remains remarkably close to the arcade original. The graphics are lovely and colorful with almost no clash.
Kieren misappropriated the screenshot from Dershmu's video at the 6-minute 49-second mark. It must be wonderful for Kieren to be able to churn out a new review so quickly, by doing a search and replace in WordPad and farting out another edition for an ever-dwindling group of gullible fools to buy. Another load of nonsense here from Kieren as he completely misunderstands gameplay yet again. Here he is, lying like a Persian rug about the basic gameplay.
You start off by fighting one at a time, but as the game progresses you have to battle multiple foes at one time.
The sentence is a complete mess, but the content is even more stupid. There are no parts in this game where you fight multiple enemies at the same time. There is only ever one other character fighting you at once. What Kieren claims as part of the gameplay loop never happens. How can he sleep at night knowing that, every time someone buys one of his titles, they are opening a door into a world completely composed of lies and misconception, presided over by complete and absolute inability?
Our hero has a basic set of fighting moves but can also collect lethal ninja stars from his opponents to help him.
I wonder what Kieren defines the word, lethal, to mean. If it takes multiple ninja stars to take out a single enemy, can they really be considered lethal?
I like the way the difficulty gradually progresses as the game goes on, even if your enemies are a bit on the stupid side.
Unless you're unfortunate enough to be blessed with the IQ of a pineapple, a gradual increase in the difficulty level should be a given, yet Kieren feels obliged to waste everyone's time by pointing this out. Maybe Kieren's used to games that are incredibly tough to begin with, but become increasingly easy until by the end you don't even have to do anything to finish the game.
As soon as you start a battle it stops to play sound effects. I have never seen this in a game before.
Really, Kieren? You claim to have been a representative of Epix, makers of the game series, where the majority of the events begin with music playing that instantly cuts out the second you begin. This is yet another embarrassing blunder. The review bumbles on, ticking his usual obvious boxes before fizzling out and scoring the game 8 out of 10. Rather than playing the game himself, Kieren decided to extract a screenshot from Dershmu's video at the 52-second mark. Anyone that's actually played the Commodore 64 version of Operation Wolf will be left scratching their head whilst reading Kieren's review. The text is yet another copy and paste job from his ZX Spectrum book, showing he has absolutely no morals whatsoever. When you buy a book of C64 reviews, you'd expect the author to have at least played the games on the Commodore. But in Kieren's world, stealing a screenshot and changing a few words around to recycle a shoddy ZX Spectrum review to C64 owners is fair game. In doing so, Kieren has introduced a significant number of errors.
You will need to look out for animals like flying ducks and trotting pigs to replenish your health along the way too. No time to cook them here.
You'll be hard-pressed to spot any animals in the C64 version, seeing as there aren't any. The arcade version features nurses, kids wearing yellow baseball caps, pigs, vultures and chickens, but the C64 version only features nurses and the kid wearing the baseball cap. There are no animals whatsoever. The final sentence of the review states,
"The only thing it's missing is big metal Uzi bolted to the top of your bread bin."
One thing that certainly is missing is the word, "ah," in front of big metal Uzi. Kieren also seems to be under the impression that all C64s were referred to as bread bins, when in fact this term was only used to describe the rather bulky look of the earliest model of C64. The screenshot Kieren included in his e-book was lifted from Al82's longplay of the game on YouTube, and can be matched at the 1 minute and 4 second mark. I suspect Kieren just plucks the release year for games out of thin air, as A Question of Sport was released in December 1988, not 1989 as Kieren would lead you to believe. Despite having an A level in English, Kieren seems to really struggle with plurals, as he obviously thinks that the plural of guest is also guest.
The game then allows you to pick 2 guests to join each team.
But rather irritatingly, you only get to pick the 2 team members under some mysterious conditions that Kieren never bothers to elaborate on.
Depending on if you are playing against the computer or another player.
I couldn't work out what the hell Kieren was talking about with this sentence. Do you only get to pick your team members in 1-player mode? Or is it only in 2-player mode? Or something else? Kieren's vocabulary is wafer thin, and he uses the same words over and over in his reviews. In this example, he uses the word just 5 times in 3 sentences.
These are just random images, rather than real people, but each one has their own specialist sport, just as the guests do in real life. Then it's just a case of playing through the various rounds and answering the questions, just as they do in the TV show. Each question must be answered within a time limit and is multiple choice, so you just have to select the correct answer out of the 3 shown on screen.
And if you haven't played the game yourself but need to pad out the review, just repeat some meaningless garbage to describe the audio-visual side of things.
Graphically it's pretty decent. The sound is pretty decent too.
Kieren continues to contradict himself by stating that the photos of the team members are random images, but further in the review, the Atari Rain Man claims that he can identify who the images represent. The screenshot was stolen from John Gage at 6 minutes and 3 seconds into his gameplay video. Kieren's grasp of the English language is severely lacking, most notably in the Quick Draw McGraw review, and he kicks the whole thing off with this absolute clangor.
One of the first things you will notice about it is that, quite similar to many arcade games, without directly copying any single game in particular, this is down to the way the game is designed.
Ignoring the missing word, "it's," in that sentence for a moment, trying to decipher anything sensible from Kieren's inane ramblings will more than likely give you a migraine. Seeing as practically every game genre under the sun exists in coin-op form, it's obvious that any arcade-style game on the computer will resemble other games. Kieren mentions that the game is quite similar to many others, but none in particular. Does this mean Kieren couldn't think of a single game that features a character on a moving train shooting enemies? Yet further down in the review, he says that the bonus level resembles an Operation Wolf-style shooting gallery. So the game is similar to many others, but none in particular. Except for Operation Wolf? And then Kieren shares another pearl of wisdom from his book of the Bleeding Obvious, informing the reader that the game has been designed that way. Rather than all the design considerations that didn't make it into the finished game presumably. This complete and utter nonsense could apply to literally thousands of games. The entire sentence is generic waffle designed to pad out the review, and any editor worth their salt would have consigned that sentence to the garbage bin. Kieren also makes another of his all-too-common textbook errors with the sentence.
Here you will meet a boss who must be dispatched before you can move on to the next section.
Kieren has clearly misunderstood when he should be using onto instead of onto, and by using the latter instead of the former, he's completely ruined the sentence. He's used a preposition, which implies taking a position on top of something. For example, a correct way to use onto would be:
Kieren climbed onto the branch.
What Kieren should have done is use onto, which would have been the correct way to do things. For example,
Kieren moved on to his new job.
It's a testament to his foolishness that Kieren has developed his error-filled writing style to such an extent that it can be relied upon, every single time, to prove he is incapable of even writing a shopping list, let alone 50 books of random, recycled, retro rubbish. He ends this threadbare, silly review by telling us that Quick Draw McGraw is not an arsonist, and that the game is good, clean fun, which one would reasonably expect from a game about a children's cartoon character. He gave the game a 7 out of 10. Rather than play the game himself and make a screenshot, Kieren decided it was far easier to simply steal a screenshot from Kavachu at the 1 minute 15 second mark. Kieren's River Raid review is kicked off by wasting a few lines telling us trivial facts about the game. These are facts that many people reading the book will know, and that have no relation to the supposed appraisal that's meant to be taking place of the C64 version. But wait, Commodore version? Stop the presses, River Raid on the Commodore? Surely not.
Many people out there will probably be surprised to find out that it was also ported to the Commodore 64.
Who are these dumbcoffs? Why would anyone be surprised that a game was ported to the C64 when they're reading a book of game reviews for that very system? If you're reading a book about C64 games, and one of them is clearly marked as being River Raid, the only thing surprising about this situation would be for the reader to jump to the illogical conclusion that the game was never converted to the system, despite it being featured here, in a book containing only reviews for games on that system, Empire Strikes Back and all other reworded reviews notwithstanding. Once more, Kieren plays his cards open and seems to be genuinely surprised that the game exists on the C64, then tries to push this as a revelation onto his readers. It's a common tactic that he uses to pad out reviews, and to showcase his own stupidity. This idiotic opening gambit makes no sense, just like most of Kieren's publications. If he wanted to highlight something surprising, he could perhaps focus on the amount of times he manages to write this specky version in a book supposedly containing reviews of C64 titles. That's a real mystery. That's what the readers would like to know. Kieren deftly barrel rolls out of answering that point though, and goes on a daring bombing mission right over Grammar HQ with his description of the fuel tanks.
However, you do need to be careful not to shoot them, as on the later levels they become fewer and far between.
This sentence is nonsense. Something cannot be fewer and far between. The phrase is few and far between, and by swapping the first word out with fewer, he's completely nuked the structure. Syntax error. Next up, we're treated to a bonus round of State the Obvious.
When the game starts off, the rivers are wide and mostly quite trouble-free, but as the game progresses, these waterways become much narrower, harder to negotiate and packed with enemies.
So basically the game gets more difficult as you progress. What a unique gameplay idea. To say this is insightful is like saying Einstein might have been a little bit smart. Then in one of his common, give them a watered-down version of the back of the box to pad things out, segments, we're told of the enemies in the game and we get a lot of background info on each, such as how they interact with, and how they're implemented within the game world.
Stationary, slow, fast, annoying.
Well written, in-depth, stimulating, revelatory. 4 words that could never be used to describe anything written by our friend the mole rat. So, the game is okay.
Despite not really being a big improvement over the Atari original.
But Kieren, how could it possibly be?
The Atari original River Raid is still a classic game that will provide a huge amount of fun on any system.
I understand. It has the golden halo of Atari hovering over it. All is well in the world of video gaming. What the hell is this statement even supposed to mean? If I program River Raid on the Z80, is it going to be fun? No. It's going to be terrible. However, according to the rules of Kieren's reality, this inevitability is anything but. A chimpanzee could be tasked with converting River Raid to a walnut using a hammer and Kieren would herald the event as the second coming of Video Jesus. It's an Atari game, but it's not on an Atari console, so gets a low 8 out of 10. It gets a pass, but it's clearly a shadow of the incredible original version released several years before for a vastly inferior system. Kieren obtained the screenshot from Dershmu's video at the 26-second mark. Kieren's reviews are simply not worth the paper they're written on, because any title from Atari will receive a much higher rating than it deserves. Sound familiar? Well, here's another case in point, Road Blasters, which Kieren gave an outrageously high rating of 8 out of 10. The entire review reads like a paid Atari puff piece that's referring to a completely different game, rather than the steaming pile of excrement that US Gold sprayed into the hands of poor C64 owners. This conversion was terrible, and game magazines of the time were much more rational with their scores, awarding the high 40s or 50s for the most part. Kieren attempts to up the ante in this review, getting things underway by mixing heavy praise with a painfully obvious typo and topping it all off with a comma exodus.
Graphically, the Commodore 64 version is pretty impressive with well-defined sprites and a really good choice of color throughout. The audio isn't quite at the same standard, however, and the game is a bit on the quiet side.
The graphics are nothing to write home about, and the color palette leaves a hell of a lot to be desired. It would not be unfair to say that the game is quite ugly to look at. Most of the levels have awful blue, cyan, or red stripes running down them, the lane markings are continuous, and it's clear the game's been shoehorned into the Outrun game engine, not that you'd ever find out that sort of information from reading any of Kieren's reviews. Kieren's intellectual level presumably doesn't permit him to know much about engines unless they're preceded by the words, Thomas, and, the tank. We're then subjected to the usual inanity as Kieren rambles on with directionless indifference in order to bump up the word count.
Did I forget to mention you also have limited fuel that you must replenish by collecting globes?
How would we know if he forgot to mention it or not? Is this some kind of meltdown on paper? What is the point of this question? It's almost as if it's meant to imply something exciting when, in reality, it only succeeds in establishing concern in the reader regarding the state of the author's brain. But with all that in mind, it can be good to leave an air of suspense and confusion when it comes to reviews. Good to leave people more confused and irritated than they were before they started reading. Mr. Atari certainly has an interesting review style, although his sacking from numerous publications supports my opinion that it's neither one that is successful or of particular interest to anyone.
When it comes to arcade conversions on the C64, Road Blasters is probably up there among the best I've played, and it will definitely please fans of the original arcade game too.
Despite Kieren's protestations, the original arcade game was a tedious and boring affair, all flash and zero substance or playability, and you'd struggle to find any sane person with much positive to say about its lackluster outing on the Commodore, let alone placing it in their list of the top 100 C64 arcade conversions. As usual, the screenshot was obtained from a YouTube video, this time Al82's longplay at the 4-minute 33-second mark. So here we have Kieren's review for Shadow Warriors, which he claims is also known as Ninja Gaiden on the home consoles. Well, that's his initial mistake, and we're still in the opening sentence. Firstly, the game was only ever known as Ninja Gaiden in North America. Secondly, Kieren states, once again embracing his vast ignorance, that it was known as Ninja Gaiden in Japan. Of course, this is demonstrably false, and has never been otherwise. The game was, and still is, known as Ninja Ryu Ken Den in Japan. Simply put, Kieren has yet again failed at checking even the most basic of information. Instead, he's chosen to run his mouth and see what comes out, be it factual or a torrent of half-baked rubbish. It should come to no great surprise to anyone listening that in this and every other case, it's very much the latter. What's becoming damningly predictable too, is his willingness to once again recycle previous work. This particular piece of nonsense is mainly cribbed from his review for the ZX Spectrum version of the game and as such, refers to gameplay elements that are completely absent from the C64 version. They are not here in lesser numbers, or on 1 or 2 levels, no. The key gameplay conceits that Kieren praises, such as the classic lampposts and bars to swing from, simply do not exist in the game whatsoever. They are not in the game in any shape or form. You can't swing from anything. It really feels good to know that the person writing this has a firm grasp on the ins and outs of what he's talking about. Still, according to Kieren, the game has excellent animation and graphics, and I must admit to being blown away by the 3 frames of animation allocated to each enemy to signify movement. It's like gazing through an incredibly intricate zoetrope, it really is. But in all honesty, the graphics and animation here are singularly terrible, with the programming being so inept that the protagonist and his many adversaries are actually rendered at a different resolution to one another. It's quite something to look at. Genuinely and completely dreadful. One wonders what Kieren would class as bad animation with this kind of rubbish being present in something he rates 8 out of 10. And indeed, about that rating. Kieren also gave the ZX Spectrum version 8 out of 10, and as already mentioned, this review is basically a slight rewording of that, glaring inaccuracies and all, and he's not bothered to change the score. It's either that or he genuinely thinks this is a good game. To put Kieren's rating into context, Zap64 reviewed the game back in September 1990 and deemed it worthy of a mere 57%. A reader's letter was also published a few issues later, saying the game was a load of rubbish and wondering if they had been sold an unfinished copy. Lemon 64 users completely disagree with Kieren's ridiculous rating, with the game receiving an average score of just 4.1 out of 10 based on 54 votes.
Abysmal. Original reviews were incredibly generous. What a total piece of trash this game is. A mediocre Ninja Gaiden arcade port marred by bad collision and wonky controls.
If we're being honest here, Kieren's clearly not even played this awful C64 conversion. Kieren begins this review with a startling statement.
I always thought this was a really strange release for the Spectrum.
Yes, a very strange release indeed. More of a simulation, really, that requires you to buy a C64 and then load the C64 game in the C64 in order to play it on the C64. Okay, this is too much stupid for one review. Next.
It's funny how sometimes the clones are remembered better than the games they are actually based upon.
So it seems we're off to a bitter start. However, although it apparently amuses Kieren, it's not uncommon for creative projects to borrow from others, using the existing idea as bedrock for something different. The Matrix wouldn't exist without Blade Runner. Star Wars wouldn't exist without the old Flash Gordon cinema serials. Kieren's books wouldn't exist without Wikipedia. Sadly, it seems he skipped Wikipedia for this one. He starts this bogus write-up with a blatant lie.
Thrust, originally released for the BBC Micro in 1986, it is pretty much just a rip-off of Atari's 1982 vector arcade game Gravatar.
This is very much untrue, as Thrust was originally released on the Commodore, with the BBC version releasing a few months later. This is why the BBC version contains the text, a #1 bestseller, on the cover. This statement is a reference to how well the C64 version did, yet Kieren still has the gall to claim the C64 version was released in 1989, a full 3 years after the BBC version. What does this all mean? It means Kieren is lying like a flat fish, once again. He then goes on to claim the game is just a ripoff of Gravatar. Everyone knows that Kieren's books are just a ripoff of Wikipedia and YouTube, so surely it's a little hypocritical to call out others for copying. It's well acknowledged that Thrust took a lot of inspiration from Gravatar, but if Kieren was capable of playing the game, he'd understand it's a different beast entirely, and why it is indeed more highly regarded. Kieren gives the game 4 out of 10, but at the time it received massive scores from major publications, was #1 in the game sales charts and has gone on to be very fondly remembered. Unlike Kieren. What makes this rating particularly offensive is that Kieren awarded the Atari 7800 Overworld RPG tile demo a score of 5 out of 10, a full point higher than one of the C64's classic titles in Thrust. The tile demo was just that, a demonstration project that was never intended to be a full game, and featured a character that couldn't even interact with the map. But according to the Marmalade Molerat, your time is better spent with the Atari taster than firing up Thrust in your C64. Kieren's lightning-fast typing fingers didn't have much to do the day he copy-pasted the BBC review into his C64 book, with only 2 differences. He botched the release year of the C64 version, and felt it was his duty to add a sentence to the Commodore book saying that he was never a fan of the game, and found the gameplay infuriatingly difficult. With his lack of gameplay skills, no wonder he sidestepped playing the game himself and instead stole a screenshot from Der Schmooze Thrust longplay at the 2-minute 58-second mark. Another review, another serving of verbal diarrhea from the Laird. Right at the start, he's deploying his, a real point of difference, nonsense again. I'm not sure why he's used that phrase multiple times, but it's a mess. It reads like it's been translated from Russian. It's a completely ineloquent and broken way to describe something. Why can't he just say the game was different from other super scalar games, instead of this point of difference silliness? No one uses that phrase, because Kieren invented it like he invented vertical horizontal scrolling. It's gibberish, and it just wrong-foots the reader from the very start. According to Moley, the game has a stage that offers a third-person view, and a stage offering a top-down view. Sadly, he clearly doesn't understand the concept of a third-person viewpoint, as both types of stage in the game involve gameplay taking place from this viewpoint. The game switching from rear view to top-down doesn't change the fact that it's all viewed from a third-person perspective. Once again, Kieren shows his stupidity and inability to understand or write about even the most basic of gameplay concepts. He goes on to describe this supposed point of difference by saying,
"In these stages the buildings actually seem to be pointing up at you, rather than them just being flat, with the angles of them change direction as you do, giving a really 3D convincing effect."
Again, has this been translated from a different language by someone from Fiverr? I think I can vaguely understand what he's trying to convey here, but is that something you should have to say about a book you've paid good money for? How unskilled as an author do you have to be in order to screw a sentence up that badly? That would get an F in grade school. Crap like this just compounds Moley's disrespect for his readers, and his arrogance. In his head, he doesn't see the need to proofread anything, because it must all be excellent. The reality is that he's incapable of proofreading anything, and it's all excrement.
In these stages the buildings actually seem to be pointing up at you.
They actually seem to be pointing up at you. Astounding.
Sadly, none of the home conversions managed to pull off any of the 3D effects of Thunderblade properly, and what you have left is a rather frustrating and broken version of the Sega hit.
So according to Kieren, US Gold released a defective game into the hands of C64 owners. Yet I can't find any evidence that US Gold had to recall the game or issue a replacement version.
The third-person parts, however, are horrific, with an almost non-existent frame rate, unresponsive controls, and it's almost impossible to judge the trajectory of enemy fire.
This is the kind of nonsense we've come to expect from the Laird. The C64 version is actually rather nippy, responds well to the joystick, and you can certainly avoid enemy fire. Only an imbecile that hasn't played the game would think otherwise. As for his non-existent frame rate garbage, even a game that updates the display once every few seconds still has a frame rate. It may round down to 0, but it exists. The only way to have a non-existent frame rate would be if the computer is physically switched off, or if you're reviewing a vaporware title such as the 128K version of Steve Davis Snooker for the ZX Spectrum, that Kieren wrote when he was just 7 years old.
When you consider that the 16-bit Sega Mega Drive version is also terrible too, that probably tells you all you need to know about C64 Thunderblade.
In a book full of moronic, nonsensical ramblings, it takes something quite special to be genuinely surprised, but never underestimate the Laird's deranged mind. For some inexplicable reason, Kieren believes that for a game to be decent on the C64, the Sega Mega Drive version must pass the Laird's lofty quality control standards.
Basically, this is just a game that shouldn't have been even attempted on the C64. The hardware just isn't up to it.
It's amazing how many arcade games were converted extremely successfully to lowly home computers, given that the arcade hardware was often several generations ahead by the time. If the Laird took a critical look at the reviews he's personally discharged, he might also come to the conclusion that the author and writing just isn't up to it. What's also astounding is that Kieren gave the game a 4 out of 10, after savaging the game. Oddly, this is only a single point higher than the score that he gave the ZX Spectrum release in his very similar review of that conversion. So similar in fact, that Kieren altered only 20 words when he forged the sham C64 review. If you ask people who know anything about games, you'll discover that Thunderblade is held in reasonably high regard on the C64. It earned a respectable 69% when it was reviewed in Zap magazine. Some Lemon 64 users have even stated that they find the game as much, if not more fun than the arcade original, and the game sits at an average score of 7.3 on the site. This is almost double the score Kieren gave, and, once again, he clearly either failed to play it, or was mentally incapable of doing so. Of course, the screenshot was stolen from a YouTube video, this time from Al82's longplay at the 1 minute 46 second mark. Well, this is a mess from the off. What is it with Kieren and release years for games? How can he continually get these wrong? The Untouchables was released by Ocean Software in 1989, not 1991 as Kieren would have you believe, and was reviewed in the November 1989 issue of Zap magazine. Kieren forgets his thesaurus again and tells us that the game was a key movie license, and recreates key scenes from the film. Imagine if a school teacher had asked their elementary school pupils to write a little bit about something they'd enjoyed over the summertime. That's just what this review reads like, or at least that's the level that the writing is at. Kieren's ability to convey information to the reader is second to everything.
Some of the walk-around sections are horizontally scrolling, while others are top-down, giving some nice variation.
It's vague nonsense like this that really renders these reviews pointless. What's that statement even supposed to mean? Can a top-down game not be horizontally scrolling? The rest of the review is incredibly vague, too. Kieren finishes the review with an out-of-the-blue statement about how Ocean were head and shoulders above their rivals on the spectrum. I'm presuming he doesn't mean that the entire programming team, and every other programming team publishing titles at the time, were autistic. With this presumably not being the case, it's hard to understand his reason for writing this in a book about the Commodore 64. But, of course, it becomes obvious when we realize that it's yet another review where he's just changed the name of the system for each book, and once again, he's not even bothered to do anything more than skim read each review as he continues on his self-defeating cut-and-paste rampage. Genuinely pathetic, unlike the game, according to Kieren, as he gave it an 8 out of 10. The screenshot was lifted from a YouTube video by Gansteeth, and was taken at 5 minutes and 35 seconds. We could start with the usual preamble on Uridium, but I think it's better just to let Kieren set the scene with what could, quite possibly, be one of the most stupid things I've ever read.
For those who are somehow unaware, Uridium is somewhat of a mix of the two most popular types of shoot-'em-up, horizontal and vertical. This is because although the screen does scroll horizontally, the action is actually viewed from above, like a vertical shooter.
This is quite incredible. Kieren has invented a new genre, the horizontally scrolling vertical shooter. I wonder, if I turned my TV on its side while playing the game, would I have invented the vertically scrolling horizontal shooter, or would that be an incorrect assumption? Kieren seems to define a vertical shooter as anything viewed from above, regardless of what direction the playfield's scrolling in. The in-game viewing angle has everything to do with whether or not the game's a vertically scrolling horizontal shooter, or a horizontally scrolling vertical shooter. The actual direction that the game's scrolling in has nothing to do with it. Why would it? I wonder, at what point in Kieren's head does a vertical shooter become a top-down shooter? Would the play area have to be static, or would that not matter, being as the viewpoint would remain the same? If the latter's the case in his mind, then a game like the dungeon crawler, Dandy, would be a vertical shooter, according to Kieren. I believe, top-down horizontal shooter, is the term he's looking for, but instead of just thinking for a moment he chose to write a load of absolute nonsense, then has the gall to patronize his readers who may not have heard of the genre. And that would be all of them, because it doesn't exist. However, at least we now know that Roger Keane was right when he suggested Kieren had never played Sanction. If we adopt Kieren's view on things, then we can only come to the conclusion that game actually scrolls horizontally and vertically at the same time. It would have made his head explode if he'd been anywhere near it. Thankfully, that didn't happen and he continued to write absolute drivel, for no one. If you watched my review of Kieren's A-Z of Atari ST Games, you may have a sense of déjà vu when you hear this sentence.
When you destroy the ship, you simply move on to another one, only march harder.
As you can probably guess, the bulk of this review has been copied and pasted from his Atari ST publication, with minimal changes to fabricate this supposed C64 review. He finishes this review by giving the game a gushing 10 out of 10. It's apparently his favorite game on the system. He is so incompetent that he can't even describe what genre it is, wasting almost a whole review attempting to do so. As one of the world's leading authorities on vaporware titles, it's fitting that Kieren rewarded C64 owners with his review of Imagine's 1988 release of Victory Road, a game so poor that Ocean decided not to publish it. However, a game not actually existing has never stood in the way of a Laird review, so he efficiently copied and pasted his ZX Spectrum text into the book. For the screenshot, he found Gansteith's YouTube video of the terrible 1987 US release, so skipped ahead to 1 minute 50 seconds and pressed the print screen button. Another review successfully in the bag, and his work was pretty much done. Unfortunately for Molly, his original review had never been proofread in the first place, or had been deemed acceptable for publication by a blind monkey that was far more interested in throwing its own feces around its cage than checking Kieren's output. The same mistakes that exist in this C64 reincarnation are present in all his other copy-paste versions of this review.
This time the conversion duties were taken up by Ocean Software's arcade label Imagine, and as usual they did a pretty good job here.
So the Ocean Software release, which doesn't exist, was pretty good. Yet further on in the review,
this C64 port of Victory Road is absolutely horrendous in almost every regard. The ugly graphics look like somebody never finished drawing them, the monotonous music is an insult to the SID chip, and the gameplay is slow and unresponsive. They also removed the all-important 2-player mode, leaving no redeeming features. One of the worst arcade ports available on the C64.
Take a bow, Ocean, for doing a pretty good job of creating one of the worst arcade ports available, and all for a game that the UK publisher cancelled twice and never released. Worth 3 out of 10, according to the Molerat. If you're after an accurate account of what happened with this title, you can read about it on the Games That Weren't website, for free. In March of 2018, Kieren attempted to hoodwink the Sega gaming community by claiming to be a representative of the company Epix, and later he clarified that he was definitely part of the company. Atari's equivalent of Pinocchio was duly exposed, threw a tantrum and left the thread with his tail firmly between his legs. If you're going to be dishonest about your ability and profess to be some kind of expert in your field, you need to lay the groundwork by doing some basic research first. Yet it's abundantly clear that Kieren's unfamiliar with the Games series from Epix, as Kieren's review claims that World Games followed on from California Games. World Games was in fact the fourth title in the Games series from Epix, released in 1986 and originating on the C64, almost a full year before California Games was released. For Kieren to suggest that the game somehow followed on from the next game in the series shows his level of utter stupidity and complete indifference regarding facts. Kieren's claims of attaining an A level in English look dubious at best, as he attempts and subsequently fails to spell the word practice. He's using the word as a verb, so it should end in SE, instead of CE. It was extremely foolish of Kieren to include a screenshot displaying the name of the competitor so clearly visible on screen, as it was almost effortless to play match the stolen screenshot to William Hunter's YouTube video, where he'd used the name Umaguma. You can witness the weightlifting event at 8 minutes and 4 seconds in William's video. Kieren's had a huge hard-on for Yogi Bear for as long as I can remember, with the character featuring prominently in his e-books. Rather ironically, Kieren talks about budget label high-tech software milking their Hanna-Barbera license for all it's worth, while at the same time, copying and pasting almost identical review text from the ZX Spectrum book into this C64 edition. Kieren's review of Yogi's Great Escape features in no less than 5 of his dire books, all scoring 4 out of 10, and the differences between the versions is almost non-existent. Learning from one's mistakes does not apply to Kieren, as he continues to spell the word license incorrectly. He's talking about the license as a noun, so it should be spelt with CE at the end, rather than the verb, to license, which ends in SE. According to Kieren, the aim of the game is to try and escape park before you are caught. Perhaps there's a hidden driving section in the game, where Yogi's trapped in a vehicle and desperately trying to find the park brake lever. The most bizarre complaint Kieren has with the game appears to be that there are no real enemies or weapons. Is Kieren on some heavy medication that means the enemies in the game are imaginary to him, and that he can walk straight through them? And what kind of weapons did Kieren expect a picnic basket-stealing bear would have at his disposal? Perhaps Kieren had envisaged a more violent game where Yogi Bear took on the role of Matrix from Commando, armed himself to the hilt with assault weapons, grenades and rocket launchers, and rampaged around Jellystone Park in an M1 Abrams tank. Yet again, I suspect Kieren has never actually played the C64 version himself, as he fails to mention anything specific to the game such as the rather neat intro sequence where Yogi and Boo Boo push the game credits into position. Instead he's simply watched a video and stolen a screenshot for his book from Al82's longplay at the 2-minute 54-second mark. It's fitting to cap things off with something as useless as this, Kieren's review for the puzzle game, Zenji. This supposed review amounts to Kieren giving nothing but a bare-bones description of the game, before going on to say it reminds him of something from the future. Incredible. Still, it's good to know he keeps his fingers on the pulse of retro gaming, combining Shakespeare-quality writing and pointing out unique gameplay features.
If one of the baddies hits you, then you lose a life.
Kieren's English is on a level comparable to other scammers, such as those from Nigeria.
It has sets the difficulty just right.
He also says puzzle games are never graphically impressive. Portal, The Witness and a host of others would like a word on that front. To all intents and purposes, this reads like an inlay. It only barely touches the surface of the game in question and leaves the reader with more questions than answers. Much like every other review in this dreadful book, the screenshot was once again stolen from a YouTube longplay by Der Schmoo at the 4-minute 25-second mark. So, where is this going to go next? Will Kieren take this constructive feedback on board? Will he withdraw his current catalog from sale to give them the editorial attention they so clearly need? Will he, and can he, up the quality of his output? Or will he attempt to remove all mentions of the video from the internet with fake DMCA requests, desperately hoping he doesn't receive legitimate counter-strikes for issuing fake takedowns, behavior which could easily result in the destruction of his YouTube account for the second time in a year? It seems ironic that someone who frequently refers to himself as a professional writer and an authority on retro gaming would allow himself to release such trash, let alone defend it. It is indefensible, and to release something like this into the market is to make it open to criticism. The mole rat is a giver not a taker, unless it comes to taking your money for nothing. Everything he does is done to belittle and smear, whilst casting himself in a singularly angelic light. He's quite happy to rubbish the creative output of others, but, when the spotlight is on him, he'll think nothing of writing off everyone's opinion but his own as trolling. I've read a lot of his journalistic submissions over the years and I've read his books. I've read all of them. I could have chosen anyone for this review and made, effectively, the same video. There is nothing here of worth, nothing whatsoever. You can read and watch all that you want online about these games and could find out 10 times what this supposed expert has told you in a matter of minutes, for free, and in more enjoyable company. These represent nothing but willful inanity and deception behind a paywall. For anyone considering buying any of these A to Z C64 guides, I'd offer the same advice that I'd give to anyone wanting to bounce on a trampoline on a helicopter launch pad. Stay well clear.